The candles in the great hall of Ashcombe Manor burned bright over 300 guests, and in the middle of that glittering crowd, a young woman named Alina Whitfield stood completely alone. She did not know it yet, but within the next 60 seconds, her life would split into two halves, a before and an after, and nothing about the quiet farm she came from would ever be able to hold her again. Lord Reginald Ashcombe had noticed her the moment she walked through the tall oak doors. Her gown was simple, made of plain gray wool instead of silk, and her hands, though gloved, still carried the faint roughness of someone who had known real work. He turned to the two young men beside him, both dressed in fine coats with gold buttons, and he smiled the smile of a man who believed himself untouchable. He raised his glass toward her, not in greeting but in mockery, and he spoke a single sharp sentence in Latin, low enough that he thought only his friends would understand it. The words meant that she was nothing more than the daughter of a man who raised pigs for a living, dressed up and pushed into a room where she did not belong. His friends laughed behind their hands. A few nearby guests, catching only the tone and not the words, laughed too, simply because laughter is contagious in rooms full of wine and candlelight. Alina heard every word. She understood every syllable. She turned toward him slowly, and the smile that had begun to spread across his face faltered the instant he saw her expression. There was no shame in her eyes. There was no fear. There was something far more dangerous, a stillness, the kind of calm that comes right before a storm breaks. She answered him in Latin as well, and her accent was flawless, her grammar perfect, her tone even sharper than his had been. She quoted an old Roman philosopher, one Reginald had studied at university but clearly never understood, and she used his own words to explain that true nobility was never a matter of blood or birth, but of character, and that a man who insulted strangers to entertain his friends had proven himself to have neither. The hall, which had been filled with music and chatter only a moment before, fell into a silence so complete that the string quartet in the corner nearly lost their place in the song. Every head turned. Every eye moved from the pig farmer's daughter to the young lord whose face had gone the color of old parchment. Nobody in that room had expected this. Nobody, least of all Reginald Ashcombe, who had spent his entire life believing that people like Alina existed only to be looked down upon, had imagined that the joke would turn so completely and so publicly against him. For a moment he tried to laugh it off, tried to pretend that her response was simply a clever trick, something memorized and repeated without real understanding. But when he asked her, still in Latin, to explain the deeper meaning behind the philosopher's words, she did so without hesitation, weaving in a second quotation, then a third, building an argument so precise and so devastating that even his own friends began to step back from him, unwilling to be caught standing too close. A murmur rippled outward through the crowd, spreading from person to person like fire along a fuse. Who is she? Where did she come from? How does a farmer's daughter speak better Latin than a man who spent 4 years at Oxford? Alina did not answer any of those whispered questions herself. She simply held Reginald's gaze for one more long moment, gave a small, polite curtsy that somehow felt more like a verdict than a courtesy, and turned to walk deeper into the hall, leaving him standing there with his glass still raised and his mouth slightly open. Behind her, the noise of the party slowly returned, but it had changed in tone completely. Where before there had been polite indifference toward her, now there was something else entirely, a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and in some corners, a simmering resentment that would not stay quiet for long. Lady Beatrice Hollies, the family friend who had brought Alina to the ball in the first place, hurried through the crowd to reach her, her face pale with worry and something close to awe. "You should not have come here tonight," Beatrice whispered, gripping Alina's arm. "I told you these people would look for any reason to embarrass you." Alina allowed herself a small, tired smile. "They did not embarrass me," she said quietly. "I believe it went the other way." Beatrice glanced back over her shoulder toward Reginald, who was still standing frozen near the refreshment table while his friends muttered to one another and cast uneasy glances in Alina's direction. "That is precisely what worries me," Beatrice said. Men like him do not forgive being made small in front of everyone they know. Tonight you have won something, Alina, but you may have also made an enemy who will not rest until he finds a way to take it back. Alina did not respond right away. She let her gaze drift across the room, past the glittering chandeliers and the silk gowns and the carefully polished shoes, and for a brief moment she thought of home. She thought of the smell of hay and mud, of her father's rough hands guiding a plow through the field before dawn, of the small candle her mother used to light every evening after the farm work was finished, so that Alina could practice her letters. None of these people in this grand hall knew what it meant to rise before the sun, to carry water from the well with arms that ached, to fall asleep with dirt still under your fingernails and wake up to do it all again. They saw her dress and her hands, and they thought they understood exactly who she was. They had no idea. "Whatever comes next," Alina said finally, turning back to Beatrice with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "I would rather face it honestly than spend my life pretending to be something I am not, just to make people like him comfortable." Beatrice studied her for a long moment, then let out a breath that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "You are either the bravest young woman I have ever met," she said, "or the most reckless. Perhaps you are both." Across the room, Reginald Ashcombe had finally found his voice again, though it came out sharper and colder than he intended. He turned to his friends and tried to dismiss the entire exchange with a wave of his hand, claiming that the girl had simply repeated something she had overheard once and did not truly understand. But his friends did not laugh this time. One of them, a young man named Charles Bramwell, only shook his head slowly. "She understood it better than you did, Reginald," Charles said under his breath. "Everyone here saw that." Reginald's jaw tightened. He set his glass down on the table with more force than necessary, the crystal ringing out a sharp, cracking sound that drew a few more curious glances his way. For the first time in his life, in a room full of people he had grown up believing existed to admire him, Reginald Ashcombe felt something he had never truly felt before. He felt small. He did not yet know her name. He only knew that she had humiliated him in front of everyone whose opinion mattered to him, and that fact alone was already beginning to twist itself into something dark and dangerous inside his chest. Meanwhile, on the other side of the hall, an older gentleman with silver hair and sharp, observant eyes had watched the entire exchange with quiet interest. His name was Sir Walter Pemberton, a retired scholar and a distant cousin of the Ashcombe family, and unlike most of the guests in that room, he had not laughed when Reginald made his joke. He had, in fact, been the only person close enough to fully understand both the insult and the response, and something about the fire in the young woman's eyes had reminded him of students he had once taught at university, decades ago, before he had grown too old and too tired to continue. He made his way slowly through the crowd, leaning slightly on his cane, until he reached the spot where Alina and Beatrice stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens. "Forgive an old man's curiosity," he said, his voice warm despite its rasp, "but I have not heard Latin spoken so beautifully in this house in a very long time. Might I ask where a young lady learns to argue Cicero so convincingly?" Alina turned to face him, uncertain at first whether this was another trap, another aristocrat looking for a reason to laugh at her expense. But there was no mockery in his expression, only genuine curiosity, and something in his gentle tone put her slightly at ease. "My mother taught me," she said simply. "She once worked as a governess before she married my father. She never stopped believing that knowledge was worth more than land or title, and she made certain I understood that too, even after we had very little of anything else." Sir Walter's eyebrows lifted with interest. "And your mother," he asked gently, "is she here tonight?" Alina's expression shifted, just slightly, a shadow passing behind her eyes. "She passed away 3 years ago," she said quietly. "But everything she taught me, I still carry with me. Tonight was simply the first time I had reason to use it in front of people who assumed I had nothing worth saying." Sir Walter studied her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face softened even further. "Then your mother, wherever she is, must be very proud of you tonight," he said. What you did in this hall took more than knowledge, my dear. It took courage. Knowledge without courage is nothing more than a locked door that no one ever opens." Before Alina could respond, the sound of the orchestra picking up a new song drifted across the hall, and couples began moving toward the dance floor once more, the party slowly resuming its usual rhythm around the edges of the moment that had just shaken it. But something fundamental had changed, and everyone in that room could feel it, even if they could not yet say exactly what it was. As the evening continued, Alina noticed the way people's eyes followed her now, not with the polite dismissal she had grown used to, but with something closer to careful, guarded interest. A few of the younger guests approached her directly, curious to hear more about her exchange with Reginald, while others kept their distance, watching from across the room with expressions she could not quite read. She caught sight of Reginald once more before the night ended, standing near the far wall with his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a small, cold shiver down her spine. It was not simple anger she saw there. It was something colder, more calculating, the look of a man already turning over plans in his mind, searching for a way to reclaim what he believed had been unfairly taken from him in front of everyone he knew. Alina held his gaze for a moment, refusing to look away first, and then deliberately turned back to the conversation Beatrice had drawn her into, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. But as the carriage carried her and Beatrice away from Ashcombe Manor later that night, rolling slowly down the long gravel drive under a sky full of cold, distant stars, Alina found herself staring out the window in silence, replaying the entire evening in her mind. She thought of her mother's patient voice guiding her through Latin verbs by candlelight. She thought of her father, waiting up for her return, worried as always about how the evening might have gone. And she thought of Reginald Ashcombe's face in that final, frozen moment, the exact instant when his certainty about the world and about people like her had cracked wide open. Whatever happens next, she thought quietly to herself as the manor disappeared behind them into the darkness, I will not regret tonight. Whatever comes, I will not regret speaking the truth in front of people who believed silence was the only thing my kind was ever allowed to offer them. She had no way of knowing in that quiet carriage ride home just how far the story of that single moment would travel before the week was through, or how many lives it would touch, or how deeply it would change the course of her own. All she knew, as the wheels rattled steadily beneath her and the countryside rolled past in shadows, was that something had shifted tonight, something that could not be undone, and that she was not sorry for it, not even a little. The pig farmer's daughter had spoken, and the aristocracy, whether they liked it or not, had been forced to listen. The morning after the ball, Reginald Ashcombe woke to the sound of his own name being whispered through the halls of his family estate, and not in the way he was used to hearing it. He had barely finished dressing when his valet mentioned, with careful hesitation, that word of the previous night's events had already reached 3 separate households before breakfast had even been served. By the time Reginald made his way down to the dining room, his father, Lord Marcus Ashcombe, was seated stiffly at the head of the table with a folded letter in his hand, and an expression that made the room feel colder than the weather outside. "Sit down," his father said, not looking up. Reginald sat, though every instinct told him to turn around and leave the house entirely rather than face whatever was coming next. His father set the letter down on the table and slid it toward him without a word. It was from Lady Fairweather, a woman known throughout their circle for knowing everything that happened in every ballroom within 50 miles, and for making certain that everyone else knew it too. Reginald read the letter in silence. It described, in vivid and almost gleeful detail, exactly how a farmer's daughter named Alina Whitfield had answered his private Latin insult with a public correction so precise and so devastating that half the room had reportedly gone silent for nearly a full minute. It described his face turning pale. It described his friends stepping away from him. It even mentioned, cruelly, that Charles Bramwell had been overheard saying the girl understood Cicero better than the son of a viscount ever had. You embarrassed this family in front of the entire county, his father said, his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow far more frightening than shouting would have been. Do you understand what people are saying this morning? They are not laughing at the girl, Reginald. They are laughing at you. Reginald's jaw tightened. She had no right to speak to me that way, he said. I was simply making an observation. It was a private remark between friends. It was not private if half the room could see your lips moving and half the room understood exactly what your face looked like when she answered you. His father snapped. You made a fool of yourself, and worse, you made a fool of this family, over a joke you could not even manage to keep quiet. Reginald had no response to that. He sat there in silence, staring at the letter at Lady Fairweather's elegant, mocking handwriting, and felt something cold and heavy settle in his chest. He had spent his entire life being told, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that he was destined to matter, that his name alone would open every door he ever wished to walk through. Last night, in the space of a single sentence, all of that certainty had cracked. His father stood from the table, buttoning his coat with sharp, efficient movements. I expect you to fix this, he said. I do not care how. But I will not have this family's name attached to a joke that every household in this county is repeating over breakfast. Do you understand me? Reginald understood. What he did not yet understand was how he was supposed to fix something that had already spread so far beyond his control. Across the county, in the modest farmhouse where Alina Whitfield had grown up, the morning was unfolding very differently. Her father, Edmund Whitfield, a broad-shouldered man with sun-weathered skin and hands permanently marked by decades of hard labor, sat across from her at their small wooden table, listening as she recounted the events of the previous night for the second time, unable to fully believe what he was hearing. You spoke to Lord Ashcombe's son in Latin, he said slowly, as though testing the words in his mouth, in front of everyone. He spoke to me first, Alina reminded him gently. He simply did not expect me to answer. Edmund set down his cup of tea and looked at his daughter for a long moment, something complicated passing behind his tired eyes. Your mother always said this day would come, he said finally. She used to tell me that all the hours she spent teaching you, after working the fields all day, after cooking, after everything else, that it would matter someday. I did not always believe her. I am glad I was wrong. Alina reached across the table and took her father's rough hand in her own. It matters because of you too, she said quietly. You let her teach me, even when the neighbors thought it was foolish. Even when people said a farmer's daughter had no use for Latin or philosophy, you never once told her to stop. Edmund's throat tightened, and he looked away for a moment, out the small window toward the fields where the pigs were already stirring in the early morning light. Your mother saw something in you that the rest of the world was too blind to notice, he said. I only had the sense to trust her judgment. That is all. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a knock at the door, sharp and unfamiliar, the kind of knock that immediately made both of them go still. Edmund rose and crossed the small room, and when he opened the door, he found a young messenger boy standing there, slightly out of breath, holding a folded piece of parchment sealed with wax. For Miss Alina Whitfield, the boy said, holding it out. Alina took the letter with a puzzled expression, breaking the seal carefully. Inside, in elegant, looping handwriting, was an invitation, not from Lord Ashcombe's household, but from Sir Walter Pemberton, the elderly scholar she had spoken with briefly at the edge of the ballroom the night before. He was inviting her to visit his private library the following week, expressing a wish to discuss, as he put it, the finer points of Ciceronian rhetoric with someone who clearly understood it far better than most of his former university students ever had. Alina read the letter twice, her heart beating a little faster with each line. It was one thing to have humiliated a young lord in front of a crowded ballroom, driven by pride and by the memory of her mother's voice urging her never to let herself be diminished. It was another thing entirely to be invited, formally and respectfully, into the private study of a man whose reputation as a scholar was known even in the small farming village, where Alina had spent her entire life. What is it? Her father asked, watching her expression shift from confusion to something like disbelief. Alina looked up at him, and for the first time since the previous night, a genuine, unguarded smile spread across her face. "I believe," she said slowly, "that last night was only the beginning of something." Meanwhile, back in the county's grander households, the story continued to spread with a speed that surprised even the people telling it. By midday, 3 separate versions of the events at Ashcombe Manor were circulating, each slightly more dramatic than the last. In one version, Elinor had reduced Reginald to tears in front of the entire ballroom. In another, she had recited an entire speech from memory, flawless and unbroken, while he stood frozen and speechless. The truth, though impressive enough on its own, seemed almost too simple compared to the increasingly elaborate rumors taking shape in drawing rooms across the county. Lady Constance Fairweather, the very woman who had written the gleeful letter to Lord Ashcombe that morning, found herself hosting an impromptu gathering of her closest friends that afternoon, all of them eager to hear every detail she had managed to gather. Constance was a woman who thrived on being at the center of every important conversation, and she had quickly recognized that the story of the pig farmer's daughter and the humiliated young lord was destined to become the talk of the entire season. "I hear she is quite plain-looking," one of the women said, sipping her tea with obvious delight at the gossip. "Simple dress, simple manners, nothing at all remarkable except this strange talent for languages." "There is nothing simple about outsmarting a young man who attended Oxford," Constance replied smoothly, though something calculating flickered behind her eyes even as she spoke. "If half of what I have heard is true, this girl may prove to be far more interesting than any debutante we have seen in years." Interesting was not entirely the word Constance meant, though she did not say so aloud. Beneath her polite curiosity, a sharper, colder thought was already beginning to take shape, one that would not fully reveal itself for several more weeks. Constance Fairweather did not appreciate surprises within her carefully ordered social world, and a farmer's daughter capable of humbling the son of a viscount in a single sentence was, in her estimation, precisely the kind of disruption that needed to be understood, and if necessary, contained. For now, however, she smiled and continued to gather every detail she could, filing each piece away carefully, the way a hunter studies the movements of prey long before deciding when to strike. By evening, word of the incident had reached even the local newspaper, where a brief, teasing mention appeared in the society column, careful not to name Elinor directly but describing, in coy and suggestive language, a certain young lady of humble origins who had proven herself more than capable of matching wits with the finest educated gentlemen of the county. The article spread even further than the drawing-room gossip had, reaching households that had never even heard of the Ashcombe or Whitfield families before that day. In his own household, Reginald spent the remainder of the day locked in a simmering, restless anger that refused to fully settle into any single shape. Part of him wanted to dismiss the entire incident as nothing more than an unfortunate accident, a lucky guess on the girl's part that had simply caught him off guard. But another part of him, a quieter and more honest part that he did not enjoy listening to, kept replaying the exact moment she had answered him, the precision of her Latin, the calm certainty in her voice, and he could not fully convince himself that it had been anything other than genuine, formidable skill. That evening, as the sun began to set over the Ashcombe estate, Charles Bramwell arrived unannounced, letting himself into the study where Reginald sat brooding over a glass of untouched brandy. "You look like a man who has lost an argument he still refuses to admit he lost," Charles said, settling into the chair across from him without waiting for an invitation. Reginald did not look up. "I have not lost anything," he said. "I made a poor choice of words at a party. That is all this is." Charles studied his friend for a long moment, and something in his expression softened slightly, the teasing edge fading into something more sincere. "You know that is not all this is," he said. "I was standing right beside you, Reginald. I saw your face. Whatever you tell your father, whatever you tell yourself, you and I both know the truth of what happened last night." Reginald finally looked up, his eyes tired and guarded. "And what exactly is the truth, according to you?" Charles leaned forward slightly. The truth is that you insulted someone you assumed could not defend herself, and she proved you wrong in front of everyone whose opinion you have spent your entire life trying to impress," he said simply. "The question now is not whether that happened. Everyone already knows it happened. The question is what you intend to do about it." Reginald was silent for a long moment, staring down into his glass. "What would you have me do?" he asked finally, his voice quieter than before. "Apologize to a farmer's daughter in front of the same people who watched her humiliate me. That would only make things worse." "Perhaps," Charles said carefully, "or perhaps it would prove that you are capable of more than the person she saw in that ballroom last night. Either way, Reginald, sitting here drinking and stewing is not going to change what people are already saying about you across the entire county. You have to decide, and soon, whether you intend to become the punchline of this story for the rest of the season, or whether you intend to write a different ending for yourself." Reginald did not answer right away. He simply sat there, turning his friend's words over in his mind, feeling the weight of his father's earlier demand pressing down alongside them. Somewhere out there, in a small farmhouse he had never once thought to notice before last night, a young woman he had wronged was quietly becoming the most talked-about figure in the entire county. And Reginald Ashcombe, for the first time in his privileged, carefully arranged life, had absolutely no idea what to do next. By the time night fell fully over the county, two very different households sat in quiet contemplation of the same event, though from entirely opposite ends of the story. In one, a proud father held his daughter's hand across a humble wooden table, marveling at the unexpected doors that seemed to be opening before her. In the other, a furious lord paced the length of his study, already plotting how to salvage a reputation he feared might never fully recover. And somewhere between those two households, quietly, almost invisibly, a woman named Constance Fairweather sat by candlelight composing letters to friends in distant towns. Letters that would soon carry Eleanor Whitfield's name even further than the gossip already had, though not entirely for reasons Eleanor herself would have chosen. The story of the pig farmer's daughter who humbled a lord had only just begun, and already forces neither Eleanor nor Reginald could fully see were beginning to gather around it, each with their own reasons, each with their own quiet, unspoken plans. A week after the ball, Eleanor found herself standing at the edge of a fine gravel drive, staring up at the tall stone facade of Pemberton House, a place far grander than any building she had ever entered except for Ashcombe Manor itself. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the front of her simple green dress, the same one her mother had sewn for her 3 years earlier, and she reminded herself firmly that she had already survived one intimidating room full of aristocrats. This surely could not be worse. Sir Walter Pemberton greeted her personally at the door, waving away the servant who had answered before Eleanor could even announce herself. He looked exactly as she remembered him from the ballroom, silver-haired and slightly stooped, but his eyes carried the same sharp, lively curiosity that had first drawn her attention that night. "Miss Whitfield," he said warmly, extending his hand, "I confess I have thought of little else since our brief conversation at Ashcombe Manor. Please come in. I have been looking forward to this all week." He led her through a long hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and Eleanor found herself glancing at each one, wondering what those painted eyes would think of a farmer's daughter walking beneath them. But Sir Walter did not pause for the portraits. He led her instead into a room unlike anything she had ever seen before, a private library with shelves rising from the floor to the ceiling, every inch crowded with books in leather bindings, their spines gleaming faintly gold in the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. Eleanor stopped just inside the doorway, momentarily forgetting every careful, composed thing she had planned to say. Her eyes moved slowly across the shelves, taking in more books than she had seen in her entire life combined, and something in her chest tightened with a longing so sharp it nearly took her breath away. "I have never seen so many books in one place," she admitted quietly, and there was no performance in her voice, only honest, unguarded wonder. Sir Walter watched her reaction with quiet satisfaction. "Then you and I are going to get along very well indeed," he said, gesturing toward two comfortable chairs positioned near the largest window. "Please, sit. Tell me everything. I want to understand exactly how a young woman from a farming family came to speak Latin with more precision than half the graduates I taught during my years at university." And so Alina told him, slowly at first, then with growing confidence as she realized he was genuinely listening, not simply waiting for his turn to speak. She told him about her mother, Margaret Whitfield, who had once worked as a governess for a wealthy family in a distant town before an unexpected illness in her own family forced her to return home. She told him how her mother had met her father, Edmund, a kind and steady man who worked the land, and how the two of them had built a modest but happy life together on the small farm where Alina had been born and raised. "My mother never stopped believing that education mattered," Alina explained, her voice growing warmer as the memories surfaced. "Even after she married my father, even after the farm work consumed most of every day, she found time in the evenings to teach me. Latin first, because she said it was the foundation for understanding nearly everything else. Then philosophy, then literature, then history. We had very few books of our own, only the small collection she had managed to keep from her years as a governess. But she made certain I read every single one of them until I nearly had them memorized." Sir Walter leaned forward slightly in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "And your father," he asked, "did he understand what your mother was building in you?" Alina considered the question carefully. "I think, for a long time he simply trusted her judgment without fully understanding it himself," she said. "He never went to school, not properly. He can read well enough to manage the farm's accounts, but Latin and philosophy were never part of his world. Still, he never once complained about the candles my mother burned late into the night for my lessons, even when money was tight. He never once told her to stop. That," Sir Walter said quietly, "is its own kind of wisdom. Not every man is wise enough to recognize a gift he cannot fully understand, and wise enough still to protect it anyway." Alina felt something loosen slightly in her chest, a tension she had carried since childhood without fully realizing it was there. For most of her life, she had grown accustomed to explaining, defending, and sometimes hiding the strange fact of her education, aware always that it made her different from every other farmer's daughter in the county, different in ways that occasionally drew suspicion rather than admiration. Sitting here in this grand library with a man whose entire life had been devoted to scholarship, she felt, for the first time, that her difference might actually be understood rather than merely tolerated. "Your mother," Sir Walter continued gently, "you mentioned she passed away 3 years ago. May I ask what happened?" Alina's expression grew quieter, more careful, though she did not look away. "A fever took her," she said. "It happened quickly over the course of only a few weeks. She was teaching me the works of Virgil right up until she became too weak to hold the book steady in her hands. Even then, she made me read aloud to her, insisting that my pronunciation still needed correcting." Sir Walter was silent for a moment, respecting the weight of the memory. "Then she sounds," he said finally, "like a truly remarkable woman." "She was," Alina said simply. "Everything I am, everything I know, I owe to her. When I answered Lord Ashcombe at the ball, I was not simply defending myself. I was defending everything she spent her life building in me, often at real cost to herself. I could not let that be dismissed as though it meant nothing." Sir Walter nodded slowly, understanding dawning fully in his expression. "That," he said, "explains a great deal about the fire I saw in your eyes that night. It was not merely pride, though pride certainly played its part. It was loyalty to a memory that clearly still guides you." They spent the next several hours deep in conversation, moving from Cicero to Aristotle to the histories of ancient Rome, and Alina found herself speaking more freely and more confidently than she had in years, matching Sir Walter's knowledge point for point, occasionally correcting small details in his memory with a gentle precision that made him laugh with delighted surprise more than once. "You are wasted on farm work," Sir Walter said eventually, as the afternoon light began to soften into evening gold across the library shelves. "I do not say that to diminish your father's profession, which is honest and necessary work." I say it because a mind like yours deserves the chance to be tested against the finest scholars this country has to offer, not simply the son of a viscount who happened to insult you at a party. Elinor felt a flicker of hope rise in her chest, quickly followed by a familiar practical caution. And how precisely, she asked carefully, does a farmer's daughter gain access to such opportunities? Universities do not open their doors to women, Sir Walter, regardless of how well we understand Cicero. Sir Walter's expression grew thoughtful, almost mischievous. No, he admitted, they do not yet. But universities are not the only place where minds are tested and respected, my dear. There are private societies, intellectual salons, gatherings of scholars and thinkers who care far more about the sharpness of an argument than the name attached to it. I happen to have connections to several such circles. If you are willing, I would be honored to introduce you. Elinor stared at him, momentarily unable to speak. A week ago, she had walked into Ashcombe Manor as an uninvited curiosity, tolerated only because of Beatrice Hollis's kindness. Now, sitting in this magnificent library, an accomplished scholar was offering to open doors she had never even allowed herself to imagine walking through. I do not know how to thank you, she said finally, her voice thick with emotion she had not expected to feel so strongly. Do not thank me yet, Sir Walter said with a small smile. The circles I intend to introduce you to are not always kind to newcomers, and certainly not always kind to women, however brilliant. You will need to be prepared to defend yourself just as fiercely there as you did at Ashcombe Manor, perhaps more so. But something tells me, Miss Whitfield, that you are more than equal to the challenge. As the visit drew to a close, and Elinor prepared to make the long walk back toward home, Sir Walter walked her to the door personally, pausing before she stepped outside into the cool evening air. One more thing, he said. Word of your exchange with young Ashcombe has spread further than you may realize. I would advise some caution in the coming weeks. Not everyone who becomes curious about you will do so with kind intentions. There are those in our society who do not take kindly to their assumptions being challenged, and they can be far more dangerous than a single embarrassed young lord. Elinor absorbed this warning carefully, feeling a small chill settle over the warmth of the afternoon. I appreciate the caution, she said, but I have spent my whole life being underestimated, Sir Walter. I do not intend to start living in fear of it now. Sir Walter studied her for a long moment, and something like genuine admiration passed across his weathered features. No, he said quietly, I do not suppose you do. The walk home that evening felt different from any walk Elinor had taken before. The familiar dirt road, the fields stretching out on either side under the darkening sky, the distant sound of livestock settling in for the night, all of it looked exactly the same as it always had, and yet everything felt subtly transformed. For the first time, Elinor allowed herself to imagine a future beyond the farm, beyond the narrow expectations that had always seemed to define her world, a future built not on the name she carried, but on the mind her mother had so carefully and patiently shaped. When she arrived home, her father was waiting on the front step, a lantern glowing beside him in the deepening dusk. He rose the moment he saw her approaching and studied her face carefully, searching for some sign of how the visit had gone. Well, he asked, unable to hide the anxious hope in his voice. How did it go? Elinor smiled, and this time the smile reached all the way to her eyes, warm and unguarded and full of a quiet, growing certainty. Father, she said, I believe your daughter may be about to become something neither of us ever imagined. Edmund studied her for a long moment, and then, slowly, a smile of his own began to spread across his weathered face. Your mother always said you would, he said softly. I am only glad I have lived to see the beginning of it. That night, long after her father had gone to bed, Elinor sat alone at the small wooden table where she had once studied by candlelight under her mother's patient guidance, and she opened one of the few books that had survived from her mother's collection, a worn copy of Cicero's Essays, its pages soft and yellowed with age. She traced her fingers gently along the margins, where her mother's careful handwritten notes still filled the empty spaces, and for the first time in 3 years, The grief she carried felt lighter somehow, mixed now with something new, something that felt almost like hope. Whatever came next, whatever doors Sir Walter's introduction might open, and whatever dangers his careful warning had hinted at, Alina understood one thing with complete certainty as she closed the book and blew out the candle that night. She was no longer simply the pig farmer's daughter who had once embarrassed a young lord at a party. She was becoming something else entirely, something her mother had spent years quietly building inside her, one patient lesson at a time, and there was no version of the future ahead of her that did not carry that inheritance forward. There was, however, one part of that evening in the library that Alina did not mention to her father, one that she turned over quietly in her mind long after the lantern light had faded and the house had gone silent around her. Near the end of their conversation, just before Sir Walter had walked her to the door, he had paused near one particular shelf, his fingers resting lightly on the spine of an old, well-worn volume, and his expression had shifted into something more guarded. "You remind me of someone," he had said, almost to himself, before catching himself and offering only a small, private smile when Alina asked who he meant. "It does not matter now," he had said. "It was a long time ago, and the story does not end happily. Let us hope yours writes itself differently." Alina had not pressed him further that evening, sensing that whatever memory lay behind those words was not one he intended to share so soon after their first real conversation. But the comment lingered with her all the same, a small unanswered thread woven quietly into the larger tapestry of everything else that had happened that day. She thought, too, of Beatrice, who had been the one to first bring her into rooms she otherwise never would have entered, and who had warned her so plainly on the night of the ball that people like Reginald Ashcombe did not easily forgive being made small. Beatrice had not been wrong about the danger, though she had perhaps underestimated just how quickly opportunity would arrive alongside it. Alina made a private promise to herself that night, sitting at the small wooden table with her mother's worn book open before her, that she would not let either the danger or the opportunity make her forget where she had come from, or who had sacrificed so much to make this moment possible. Her mother had never lived to see a great library, never walked the polished halls of a manor house, never stood in a ballroom surrounded by silk and candlelight. And yet everything Alina now carried within her, every quotation, every careful argument, every ounce of quiet confidence that had allowed her to stand her ground in front of Reginald Ashcombe without flinching, had been placed there patiently, one evening at a time, by a woman who worked herself to exhaustion during the day and still found the strength to teach by candlelight at night. Alina understood, perhaps more clearly than ever before, that whatever recognition or opportunity came her way in the weeks and months ahead, none of it truly belonged to her alone. It belonged equally to her mother, whose faith had never wavered even when the rest of the world would have called it foolish, and to her father, whose quiet strength had made space for that faith to grow, even without fully understanding it himself. As she finally closed the book that night and made her way up the narrow wooden stairs to her small bedroom beneath the eaves, Alina paused for a moment at the window, looking out over the dark, familiar shape of the field stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond those fields, beyond the boundaries of the only world she had ever known, new rooms were waiting to be entered, new minds waiting to be tested, and new dangers, whatever they might be, waiting to reveal themselves in time. She was not afraid. She had spent her entire life being underestimated by people who judged her only by the plainness of her dress or the roughness of her hands, and she had learned, slowly and patiently, exactly how much power there was in being consistently, quietly underestimated. Tomorrow would bring whatever it intended to bring. Tonight, she allowed herself simply to feel the quiet, steady glow of hope, warm and unfamiliar, settling gently into a heart that had grown so used to grief that it had nearly forgotten how much room remained inside it for something entirely different. 3 weeks after her visit to Pemberton House, Alina stood outside the tall iron gates of a townhouse she had never seen before, her invitation clutched tightly in her gloved hand, her heart pounding harder than she cared to admit. Sir Walter had kept his promise. Tonight she would be introduced to the Camden Circle, a private gathering of scholars, writers, and thinkers who met monthly to debate philosophy, literature, and the pressing questions of their age, and who, according to Sir Walter, cared far more about the strength of an argument than the name attached to it. She was about to discover exactly how true that claim really was. A servant led her through a wide entrance hall, and into a warmly lit sitting room where perhaps 20 people were already gathered, some seated in comfortable chairs, others standing near the fireplace with glasses of wine in hand, all of them engaged in the kind of easy, confident conversation that came from years of practice moving through rooms exactly like this one. Alina felt every eye shift toward her the moment she entered, and for a brief, unsteady moment, the old familiar doubt crept back into her chest. Then Sir Walter appeared at her side, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. "Miss Whitfield," he announced to the room, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I promised you all a discovery worth your time this evening. I do not believe I have exaggerated." A tall woman with sharp, intelligent eyes stepped forward first, introducing herself as Mrs. Harriet Sinclair, a published essayist whose work Alina had actually encountered once, second-hand, through a torn page her mother had kept tucked inside an old book. Alina mentioned this immediately, quoting the exact line she remembered, and Harriet's eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. "You remember my own words better than I do," Harriet said, half laughing. Sir Walter did not exaggerate after all. The evening unfolded from there, in a way Alina could never have fully anticipated. Rather than the polite, dismissive curiosity she had grown used to at Ashcombe Manor, the members of the Camden Circle engaged with her directly, testing her knowledge, challenging her opinions, and gradually, as the hours passed, treating her less like a curiosity and more like a genuine equal in conversation. She debated the nature of justice with a retired judge. She discussed the poetry of ancient Rome with a young university lecturer who seemed both delighted and faintly threatened by how quickly she matched his references. She found herself, for the first time in her life, in a room full of people who valued her mind above everything else about her. It was, she thought later, the closest thing to belonging she had ever felt outside of the small farmhouse where she had grown up. But even within that warm, welcoming room, whispers of a different kind continued to travel. Word of her presence at the Camden Circle spread just as quickly as word of the Ashcombe ball had, carried by guests eager to share the news of this remarkable discovery, this farmer's daughter who could apparently hold her own against scholars and lecturers alike. Within days, invitations began arriving at the small farmhouse with increasing frequency, from households Alina had never even heard of, each one curious to witness for themselves the woman who had first humbled a young lord and then charmed an entire circle of intellectuals. Not every reaction to her rising reputation was kind, however. In grand houses across the county, a quieter, more skeptical conversation was beginning to take shape, one Alina was not present to hear, but which nonetheless continued to shape the world she was now moving through. "It is unnatural," one elderly matron remarked during an afternoon tea, her voice pitched low but sharp with disapproval. A farmer's daughter, discussing philosophy with judges and scholars as though she were born to it. What next? Shall the stable boys begin lecturing at university? Her companion, a younger woman named Lady Constance Fairweather, said nothing in direct response, though her expression carried a careful, calculating stillness that betrayed far more thought than her silence suggested. Constance had been paying close attention to Alina's rise ever since that first letter to Lord Ashcombe, and what had begun as simple curiosity had slowly hardened into something closer to genuine concern for her own position within the county's social hierarchy. Constance Fairweather had spent years carefully building her reputation as the most intellectually accomplished woman in her particular circle, hosting her own smaller gatherings, cultivating friendships with scholars and writers whenever she could, always positioning herself as the exception to the rule that women were not expected to engage seriously with ideas. Alina Whitfield's sudden, unstoppable rise threatened that carefully built position in ways Constance found difficult to fully articulate, even to herself. It was not simply that Alina was clever. It was that Alina's cleverness came without any of the careful cultivation, without any of the years of strategic effort Constance had invested in her own reputation. It came, infuriatingly, naturally, and it came from a source Constance considered beneath consideration entirely. "I think we ought to meet her," Constance said finally, setting down her teacup with deliberate calm. "Do you not agree? It is always wiser to understand one's curiosities up close, rather than relying entirely on rumor." Her companion, unaware of the sharper currents moving beneath Constance's polite suggestion, agreed readily enough, and within days, an invitation bearing the Fairweather family seal arrived at the Whitfield farmhouse, inviting Alina to a small afternoon gathering at Fairweather House the following week. Alina, still riding the warm confidence of her successful evening with the Camden Circle, accepted without hesitation, unaware that she was walking directly into the first careful move of a much longer and more dangerous game. Meanwhile, Reginald Ashcombe had spent the same 3 weeks in a state of restless, uncomfortable reflection. Charles Bramwell's words had stayed with him longer than he cared to admit, and though his pride still smarted every time he thought of that humiliating moment in the ballroom, a quieter, more honest voice inside him had begun to ask questions he did not entirely want to answer. Had he truly been wronged that night, or had he simply been caught, publicly and undeniably, in the act of being exactly the kind of person his father's letters and his own private doubts increasingly suggested he had become? He found himself, more than once, riding out toward the edges of the county on the pretense of exercising his horse, only to find his path drifting closer and closer to the modest farmland where he knew, from careful and reluctant inquiry, that Alina Whitfield lived. He never approached. He told himself each time that he was simply curious, gathering information that might prove useful in restoring his damaged reputation. He did not yet allow himself to consider that his curiosity might be something else entirely. It was during one of these rides that he first heard, second-hand through a stable hand's idle gossip, that Alina had been invited to join the Camden Circle, and that she had apparently impressed even Harriet Sinclair, a woman whose sharp critical essays Reginald himself had once struggled through during his university years. The news struck him with an unexpected pang, somewhere between admiration and something closer to jealousy, though he could not have said clearly which emotion dominated. "She is becoming something none of us anticipated," he admitted quietly to Charles during one of their evening conversations, the brandy between them now more habit than comfort. "I thought, after that night, that she would fade back into obscurity once the gossip ran its course. Instead, it seems the gossip has only opened doors for her that most of us never realized existed." Charles studied his friend carefully over the rim of his glass. "And how does that make you feel?" he asked, watching Reginald's expression with genuine curiosity. Reginald did not answer immediately. Uncertain, he admitted finally, "I do not know whether I am more troubled by what I said to her that night, or by how thoroughly she has proven that I was wrong to say it." Charles allowed a small, knowing smile. "Perhaps," he suggested gently, "it is time you found out which one troubles you more. And perhaps the only way to do that is to speak with her directly, rather than riding your horse in circles around her father's fields, hoping the answer will simply present itself to you." Reginald's face flushed with embarrassment. "You knew about that?" "The entire county knows about that," Charles said, laughing despite himself. "You are not nearly as subtle as you believe yourself to be, my friend." That same week, Alina arrived at Fairweather House for the gathering Constance had arranged, dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a soft blue that had once belonged to her mother and had been carefully altered to fit her. She was greeted warmly at the door, led into a beautifully appointed drawing room filled with delicate porcelain and gleaming silver, and introduced to a small circle of women who watched her with expressions ranging from genuine curiosity to poorly disguised skepticism. Constance herself was the picture of gracious hospitality, offering tea, asking thoughtful questions about Alina's education, praising her composure at the Ashcombe ball with what appeared, on the surface, to be genuine admiration. But beneath the polished conversation, Alina gradually became aware of a subtler current running through the afternoon, small comments carefully placed to test her, questions phrased just precisely enough to probe for weaknesses that might not be immediately visible. "Your mother must have been quite remarkable," one woman commented, "to teach you so thoroughly despite the demands of farm life. Tell me, did she ever regret marrying beneath her original station, given all she apparently sacrificed for your education?" Alina recognized the question immediately for what it was, an attempt to plant doubt, to suggest that her mother's choices had been somehow tragic or mistaken rather than deliberate and proud. She answered carefully, without hesitation, describing her parents' marriage not as a sacrifice, but as a partnership built on mutual respect, a choice her mother had made freely and never once regretted, at least not in Alina's presence. Constance watched this exchange with sharp, careful attention, noting how deftly Alina navigated the subtle trap, how completely unshaken she remained even under polite but pointed scrutiny. By the time the afternoon drew to a close, Constance had gathered exactly what she had come for, though not the vulnerability she had half hoped to find. Instead, she had confirmed something far more troubling to her own carefully guarded position. Alina Whitfield was not simply clever. She was steady, self-assured, and entirely unwilling to be rattled by careful social maneuvering, which meant that whatever plan Constance eventually decided to pursue would need to be considerably more deliberate than a single afternoon of pointed questions over tea. As Alina made her way home that evening, she reflected on the gathering with a quiet, uneasy awareness that something beneath the polite surface of the afternoon had not been entirely genuine. She could not yet name exactly what she had sensed, but the memory of Sir Walter's careful warning returned to her, the reminder that not everyone who grew curious about her would do so with kind intentions. She resolved to remain watchful, without allowing that watchfulness to curdle into fear, and continued on toward home beneath a sky already turning gold with the coming sunset, unaware of exactly how soon her caution would prove to be entirely justified. That night, long after she had returned home and her father had retired to bed, Alina sat by the window of her small room, watching the last traces of daylight fade over the fields, and allowed herself to think honestly about everything that had shifted in the span of a single month. A month ago, she had been simply the pig farmer's daughter, known only within the narrow boundaries of her own small village, invited nowhere, expected by everyone around her to marry a local farmer someday and live out a life much like her mother's, minus the books and the Latin lessons that had made her mother's life quietly extraordinary despite its outward simplicity. Now she had stood in a grand library, surrounded by more books than she had ever imagined existed. She had debated philosophy with published scholars who treated her opinions as worth genuine consideration. She had walked into a drawing room full of sharp, watchful aristocratic women, and left without giving them a single crack to exploit. And yet, for all of that progress, she could not shake the quiet unease that had settled over her during the final hour of the Fairweather gathering, the sense that Constance's warm hospitality had concealed something far more calculating underneath. She thought of her mother often in these quiet moments, wondering what advice she might have offered if she were still here to offer it. Her mother had never moved in circles quite like these, had never faced the particular scrutiny of women like Constance Fairweather, but she had understood, perhaps better than anyone, the particular danger of being underestimated by people who resented being proven wrong. "Trust your instincts," Alina could almost hear her saying, in that steady, patient voice she remembered so clearly even 3 years after losing her. The people who smile widest while trying to find your weaknesses are rarely the ones who wish you well. Alina resolved, sitting there in the fading light, that she would continue forward regardless, into whatever rooms opened themselves to her next, carrying her mother's lessons and her father's quiet steadiness with her as armor against whatever careful schemes might be forming in drawing rooms she could not yet see. She had already proven, on the night of the Ashcombe ball, that she was capable of holding her ground when challenged directly. What she did not yet know, though she was beginning to suspect it, was that the challenges still ahead of her would rarely announce themselves so plainly, and that the most dangerous opponents were not the ones who insulted her to her face, but the ones who smiled sweetly while quietly searching for the exact moment to strike. Reginald arrived at the edge of the Whitfield farm on a cool gray morning, having finally run out of reasons to keep circling the property without approaching it. He tied his horse to a fence post at the far end of the field and stood there for a long moment, watching Alina in the distance as she helped her father repair a section of broken fencing. Her sleeves rolled up, her hands moving with a practical efficiency that seemed entirely at odds with the elegant Latin phrases she had used to dismantle his pride only weeks before. He almost turned back twice before he finally made himself walk forward. Alina noticed him before her father did, straightening from her work with an expression of guarded surprise that quickly hardened into something more careful and composed. "Lord Ashcombe," she said, her tone polite but distant, "this is unexpected." Edmund Whitfield straightened as well, eyeing the young lord with the kind of quiet, assessing suspicion any father might reasonably hold for the man who had publicly insulted his daughter. Reginald felt the weight of that gaze keenly, and for a moment, standing in the middle of a working farm in his fine riding clothes, he felt more out of place than he had ever felt in his own grand ballroom. "I apologize for arriving unannounced," he said, addressing them both. "I had hoped to speak with Miss Whitfield directly if she is willing." Alina glanced briefly at her father, who gave the smallest of nods before returning to his work at a slight distance, close enough to remain watchful, far enough to allow the conversation privacy. Alina set down the tools she had been holding and studied Reginald carefully. "Speak then," she said simply. Reginald had rehearsed several versions of this conversation during his ride over, each one more eloquent than the last, and every single one of them abandoned him the moment he actually stood in front of her. "I came to apologize," he said finally, the words coming out plainer and less polished than he had intended. "What I said to you that night was cruel, and it was thoughtless, and it was entirely unfair. I have spent the past month trying to convince myself that you somehow deserved correction for daring to attend a ball above your supposed station, and every single time, I have found myself unable to actually believe it." Alina studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "That is a start," she said carefully, "but an apology built from a month of wounded pride is not quite the same as one built from genuine understanding. Which is this?" Reginald was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly. "I am not certain yet," he admitted. "I know that I am tired of feeling angry about a moment that, if I am honest with myself, I created entirely on my own. I know that everyone around me continues to speak of your accomplishments in ways that used to make me resentful, and now, increasingly, make me curious rather than bitter. I am not certain that qualifies as understanding, but it feels closer to it than where I began." Something in Alina's guarded posture eased just slightly. "That," she said, "is at least an honest answer. I have grown tired, these past weeks, of people offering me carefully rehearsed compliments designed to win my favor rather than genuine thoughts. I would rather hear an honest, uncertain answer than a polished, false one." Encouraged slightly by this small opening, Reginald ventured further. "I understand if you have no wish to speak with me at length," he said. "But I confess, since that night, I have found myself unable to stop thinking about the argument you made, about virtue and true nobility. I studied those same texts at university, and yet I never once applied them to my own behavior the way you did in that single moment. I would like to understand how you arrived at that argument so quickly, if you are willing to indulge my curiosity." Alina considered him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his request against the memory of his mockery still fresh enough to sting when she allowed herself to think of it directly. Finally, she gestured toward a low stone wall at the edge of the field, and the two of them walked toward it in a silence that felt, for the first time, less hostile than uncertain. "I did not arrive at it quickly," she said once they had settled at a comfortable distance apart. "I arrived at it over years, through my mother's teaching, long before I ever imagined I would need to use it against someone like you. She believed deeply that most people mistake privilege for virtue, and she made certain I understood the difference clearly enough that I would never make that mistake myself, regardless of how the world tried to convince me otherwise." And did she ever imagine, Reginald asked carefully, that her lessons would someday be used to correct a viscount's son in the middle of his own family's ballroom? A small, unexpected smile crossed Eleanor's face, the first genuine warmth she had shown him since his arrival. "I do not believe even she was quite that ambitious," she admitted, "but I think she would have been proud regardless of the audience." They talked for nearly an hour after that, the conversation gradually shifting from careful, guarded exchanges into something closer to genuine debate. The same kind of intellectual sparring Eleanor had experienced at the Camden Circle, though with an edge of personal history that made it feel entirely different. Reginald, despite his earlier arrogance, proved to possess a genuinely capable mind when he allowed himself to engage honestly rather than performing for an audience. And Eleanor found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, enjoying the exchange far more than she had expected to. "You are not what I assumed you would be, up close," she admitted eventually, as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the field. "Neither," Reginald said quietly, "are you. I assumed before that night that people like you existed simply to be overlooked. I have spent the past month discovering exactly how wrong that assumption was, and I confess, the discovery has been considerably more humbling than I expected." Eleanor studied him carefully, searching his expression for any trace of the mocking condescension she had encountered at the ball, and found, to her genuine surprise, that it seemed to have been replaced by something far more sincere. "That does not erase what you said that night," she reminded him gently but firmly. "Nor does it erase the weeks of gossip that followed, some of which was unkind to both of us." "No," Reginald agreed, "it does not, but I hope it is at least a beginning." Their conversation was interrupted eventually by the sound of Edmund clearing his throat pointedly from across the field, a clear signal that the visit, however unexpectedly productive, had gone on long enough for a first meeting. Reginald rose, brushing off his coat, and offered Eleanor a small, genuine bow, entirely unlike the mocking gesture that had accompanied his cruel remark weeks earlier. "Might I call again?" he asked, his tone careful and uncertain in a way that suited him far better than his earlier arrogance ever had. Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering. "You may," she said finally. "Though I will warn you, Lord Ashcombe, that I do not extend second chances easily, and I will be watching closely to see whether this version of you proves lasting, or whether it fades the moment you return to rooms full of people eager to remind you of who you used to be." Reginald nodded slowly, accepting the challenge in her words without flinching from it. "Then I shall have to prove myself consistently," he said, rather than simply once. As he rode away from the farm that afternoon, something had shifted in him that he could not fully articulate, even to himself. He thought of his father's furious demand that he fix the damage to their family's reputation, and he realized, somewhat uncomfortably, that the version of fixing things he now found himself pursuing had very little to do with reputation at all, and a great deal more to do with a conversation by a stone wall that had left him feeling more genuinely challenged, and more genuinely respected as an equal, than any conversation he had shared with someone of his own social standing in years. News of his visit to the Whitfield farm did not stay quiet for long. Within days, whispers of a different kind began circulating through the county, no longer focused solely on Eleanor's remarkable rise, but now increasingly curious about the strange, unexpected friendship apparently forming between the pig farmer's daughter and the young lord she had once humiliated in front of the entire aristocracy. Some found the development charming, a fitting resolution to an already remarkable story. Others found it deeply troubling, a further sign that the careful boundaries separating their world from people like Eleanor were beginning to erode in ways they were not prepared to accept. Among those most troubled by the news was Lord Marcus Ashcombe, who summoned his son to his study the moment the rumors reached him, his expression carrying none of the careful control he had maintained during their earlier conversation about the ball itself. "Explain to me," he said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger, "exactly why my own son has been seen riding to a pig farmer's property, sitting beside his daughter for the better part of an afternoon, in full view of anyone who cared to notice. Reginald met his father's gaze steadily, drawing on a confidence he had not felt in his father's presence in years. "I went to apologize," he said simply, "and I stayed because I found the conversation worth continuing." His father stared at him for a long moment, clearly searching for some sign that his son was simply engaged in a passing amusement rather than something more serious. "You understand," he said finally, his voice lower now, more controlled, "that whatever admiration you feel for this girl's intellect cannot change the reality of her birth. A friendship, perhaps, might be tolerated if kept discreet. Anything beyond that would be an impossibility this family cannot accept." Reginald did not answer immediately, and in his silence, his father seemed to find confirmation of exactly the concern he had feared. The conversation ended there, unresolved, but the tension it created settled heavily over the Ashcombe household in the days that followed. A quiet, simmering pressure that Reginald could feel building steadily behind his father's controlled expressions every time they crossed paths. Meanwhile, at Fairweather House, Constance had received the same news with an entirely different kind of interest. A friendship, or perhaps something more, forming between the humiliated young lord and the farmer's daughter who had humiliated him, presented exactly the kind of opportunity Constance had been quietly searching for since that first gathering weeks earlier. If she could not easily expose a weakness in Aliner's character directly, perhaps she could find one in the fragile, complicated relationship now forming around her instead. A relationship still young enough, and public enough, to be shaped and manipulated by anyone clever enough to understand exactly which threads to pull. Constance began, that very evening, composing a careful letter to an old acquaintance in a distant town, one whose discretion she trusted completely, and whose particular skills she suspected might soon prove very useful indeed. The pig farmer's daughter had survived a ballroom, a scholar's library, and a drawing room full of watchful aristocratic women. Whether she would survive what Constance was now quietly beginning to plan remained, in Constance's carefully calculating mind, a far more interesting question entirely. Reginald returned to the Whitfield farm twice more over the following 2 weeks, each visit shorter than the last, careful and formal in front of Edmund's watchful presence, but growing steadily warmer in the moments Aliner allowed herself to relax into genuine conversation. He brought her, on his second visit, a small volume of poetry he had rediscovered in his family's library, one he thought she might not yet have encountered, and the sight of him arriving not with jewels or flowers, but with a book chosen specifically for the sharpness of her mind, rather than the shape of her face, told Aliner something important about how genuinely he had begun to reconsider the assumptions he once carried so carelessly. Still, she remained cautious. She had not forgotten Sir Walter's warning, nor Beatrice's earlier concern, and she understood clearly that whatever was developing between herself and Reginald existed within a world that had very little patience for the kind of quiet transformation he claimed to be undergoing. She watched him carefully during each visit, testing not simply his intellect but his character, asking pointed questions about his father's expectations, about the pressures he faced within his own household, listening closely for any sign that his newfound humility was simply a passing performance rather than something lasting. "You still have not told your father the full truth of why you keep returning here," she observed during his third visit, as they walked slowly along the edge of the field where wildflowers had begun to bloom in the early warmth of the season. Reginald was quiet for a moment before answering honestly. "No," he admitted, "I have not. Partly because I do not yet fully understand it myself, and partly because I am not certain he is capable of hearing it without demanding I end these visits entirely." And if he did demand exactly that, Aliner asked, her tone carefully neutral though her eyes remained sharp and watchful, "What then?" Reginald considered the question seriously, understanding it for the genuine test it was rather than idle curiosity. "Then I suppose," he said slowly, "I would finally discover whether the version of myself I am trying to become is strong enough to exist without his approval holding it upright. I would like to believe it is. I am not yet entirely certain." Alina accepted this honest uncertainty far more readily than she would have accepted any confident promise, recognizing in it the same kind of careful, hard-won self-awareness her own mother had once tried to instill in her. Trust, she had learned early in life, was rarely built from grand declarations. It was built slowly, through small, honest admissions exactly like this one, repeated consistently over time until they formed something solid enough to rely upon. Word of these continuing visits, however carefully conducted, could not remain entirely private in a county where gossip traveled faster than any writer could hope to outrun it. By the time Reginald made his fourth visit to the Whitfield farm, word had already reached not only his father's furious attention, but Constance Fairweather's carefully patient ears as well, arriving at precisely the moment she had been quietly waiting for. She read the report from her acquaintance with a slow, satisfied smile, understanding immediately that the fragile, still forming trust between Reginald and Alina represented exactly the kind of vulnerability she had been searching for since that first afternoon tea weeks earlier, when Alina had proven far too composed to be undone by simple questions over porcelain cups. A relationship built on such recent, still uncertain trust, Constance reasoned carefully as she folded the letter and set it aside, was a relationship that could be shaken loose with the right carefully placed suggestion, delivered to the right person, at precisely the right moment. She did not yet know exactly what form that suggestion would take. But she understood, with the patient certainty of someone who had spent years mastering the quiet art of social manipulation, that the perfect opportunity would present itself soon enough, and that when it did, she intended to be ready. The letter arrived at Ashcombe Manor on a wet, grey morning, delivered by a rider Lord Marcus Ashcombe did not recognize, and its contents struck him with the force of a physical blow. It claimed, in careful, deliberate handwriting, that his son had not merely been visiting the Whitfield farm out of simple curiosity or misplaced guilt, but had made private promises to Alina Whitfield, promises of marriage, promises that, if allowed to stand, would drag the Ashcombe name through a scandal from which it might never fully recover. The letter was unsigned, though Marcus did not need a signature to recognize the careful, poisonous precision behind it. Someone within his own social circle had crafted this deliberately, timed perfectly to strike at the exact moment his patience with his son's continuing visits had already worn thin. He summoned Reginald immediately, the letter clutched in his shaking hand. "Is this true?" he demanded, thrusting the parchment toward his son the moment he entered the study. Reginald read the letter quickly, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something closer to controlled fury as he reached the final line. "This is a fabrication," he said firmly. "I have made no promises of marriage to Miss Whitfield. I have visited her, yes, and I have come to respect her more than I respect most people within our own circle, but nothing in this letter reflects the truth of what has actually occurred between us." His father studied him carefully, searching his face for any sign of deception, and found none, though the discovery did little to ease his agitation. "Then someone wishes to make it appear true," he said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn alongside his anger. "Someone wishes to force a crisis before either of you has decided what you actually intend to become to one another." Reginald's mind raced immediately to the careful, watchful interest Constance Fairweather had shown in Alina since the earliest days of the gossip, though he had no proof, nothing beyond instinct and the memory of certain conversations that had felt, in retrospect, more calculated than they had seemed at the time. "Whatever the source," he said grimly, "this letter is designed to force your hand, and mine before either of us has time to think clearly. I intend to find out who wrote it." His father was quiet for a long moment, the letter still trembling slightly in his grip. "And what will you do," he asked finally, his voice quieter now, "once you discover the truth? Will finding the source of this letter change anything about the fact that half the county will have heard these rumors by nightfall regardless of whether they are true?" Reginald had no immediate answer for that, and the absence of one settled uncomfortably between them. By that same afternoon, the rumor had indeed begun spreading exactly as Marcus feared. carried from household to household with the same relentless speed that had once carried news of Aliner's Latin rebuke at the ball. This time, however, the story arriving at each new doorstep carried a far more dangerous shape, transforming with each retelling into something increasingly scandalous, until by evening, several versions circulating through the county's finest drawing rooms suggested not simply a promise of marriage, but something considerably less honorable, hinted at through careful, suggestive phrasing that Constance Fairweather herself had helped craft during her private conversations with a small, trusted circle of friends earlier that week. Aliner learned of the rumors the following morning, when Beatrice Hollies arrived at the farmhouse unannounced, her face pale and urgent. "You need to hear this from me before you hear it from someone crueler," Beatrice said, barely waiting to be shown inside before launching into an account of everything she had heard circulating since the previous evening. Aliner listened in growing disbelief, her hands curling into fists at her sides as Beatrice described rumors that painted her not as the composed, intelligent young woman who had earned genuine respect from scholars and society alike, but as something calculating and dishonorable, a farmer's daughter who had supposedly schemed her way into a young lord's affections for the sake of advancement, using whatever means necessary to secure a future far above her rightful station. "This is not true," Aliner said finally, her voice tight with controlled anger. "None of it is true." "I know that," Beatrice said gently, "and Reginald has apparently been telling anyone who will listen the same thing. But you and I both understand how little the truth sometimes matters once a story like this has already begun spreading. People believe what confirms what they already wish to believe about you, Aliner. There are many in this county who have been waiting for exactly this kind of story since the night of the ball, an excuse to dismiss everything you have accomplished as nothing more than calculated ambition." Aliner sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of what Beatrice had described. She thought of Sir Walter's careful warning, of the subtle tension she had sensed beneath Constance's hospitality weeks earlier, and slowly, painfully, the pieces began arranging themselves into a picture she did not want to see but could no longer avoid. "Constance," she said quietly, more to herself than to Beatrice. Beatrice's expression sharpened with sudden understanding. "You believe she is behind this." "I do not have proof," Aliner admitted, "but I have suspicion and instinct and the memory of an afternoon that felt far more calculated than kind. If I am right, this was never simply curiosity on her part. It was the beginning of exactly this." The two women sat together for a long while after that, discussing carefully what might be done, though neither could immediately settle on an answer that felt satisfying. To publicly accuse Constance without proof risked appearing exactly as calculating and desperate as the rumors already suggested Aliner to be. To remain silent risked allowing the story to grow entirely unchecked, consuming everything Aliner had worked so carefully to build over the preceding weeks. Meanwhile, the divide the rumor created rippled outward across the entire county with startling speed, revealing fractures that had been quietly forming beneath the surface of local society ever since Aliner's first dramatic appearance at Ashcombe Manor. Among the older, more traditional families, the rumor was received almost with relief, offering a convenient explanation for a development many of them had found deeply unsettling from the very beginning. Of course, they murmured to one another over tea and cards, a girl like that would resort to scheming eventually. What else could truly be expected? But among the younger, more progressive members of society, particularly those who had encountered Aliner personally through the Camden Circle or through Sir Walter's growing circle of admirers, the rumor was met instead with genuine outrage on her behalf. Harriet Sinclair herself, upon hearing the story secondhand, wrote a sharp, pointed letter to several of her own correspondents, defending Aliner's character in language that left little room for polite disagreement. "I have spent an entire evening in genuine intellectual conversation with Miss Whitfield," Harriet wrote, "and I can assure anyone repeating these rumors that nothing in her character suggests calculation or deceit. If anything, her honesty is considerably more direct and unguarded than most of the polished company I typically keep." I would encourage anyone spreading these stories to consider carefully whether they are motivated by genuine concern for the truth, or by a far less flattering discomfort with watching someone from humble origins rise so quickly on the strength of her own merit alone. Harriet's letter, copied and shared among her considerable circle of correspondence, helped slow the spread of the worst versions of the rumor, though it did little to fully extinguish the underlying tension the entire episode had exposed. The county, it seemed, had been quietly divided all along, split between those who welcomed the idea that talent and character might matter more than birth, and those who found that same idea threatening enough to fight against with whatever tools, however dishonest, they had available. Sir Walter, upon hearing the full account of the rumors, arrived at the Whitfield farm himself that same week, his expression grave and determined. "This is precisely the kind of danger I warned you about," he said, settling into the small kitchen where Aline's father had reluctantly agreed to let him sit and speak privately with his daughter. "You have risen quickly, Miss Whitfield, and quick rises always attract those who feel diminished by them. I am afraid this will not be the last attempt to undermine what you have built." "Then what would you advise?" Alina asked, her exhaustion beginning to show through her usually steady composure. Sir Walter considered the question carefully before answering. "I would advise patience and precision," he said finally. "Rash accusations, however justified, will only feed the narrative your enemies wish to construct around you. But quiet, careful investigation, gathering proof rather than simply suspicion, that is a different matter entirely. If Lady Fairweather is indeed responsible for this letter, there will be a trail, however carefully hidden. Such schemes rarely remain perfectly contained, particularly when the person constructing them believes themselves too clever to ever be caught." Alina absorbed this advice slowly, feeling something steady and determined settling back into place beneath her earlier exhaustion. "I will not hide from this," she said finally. "Whatever proof exists, I intend to find it, carefully and deliberately, exactly as you suggest. But I will not spend the coming weeks cowering in this farmhouse, waiting to see whether the county decides I deserve to be believed." Sir Walter studied her for a long moment, and something like genuine pride crossed his weathered features. "No," he said quietly, "I did not imagine for a moment that you would." As Sir Walter's carriage pulled away from the farmhouse that evening, Alina stood at the window watching it disappear down the long dirt road, and allowed herself, finally, a moment of quiet reflection on everything that had unfolded since that single sharp sentence in the Ashcombe ballroom. She had survived mockery. She had survived scrutiny. She had even cautiously begun allowing herself to trust the son of the very man who had once dismissed her so cruelly. Now she understood clearly she faced something considerably more dangerous than any single insult. A carefully constructed campaign designed not simply to humiliate her, but to unravel everything she had built, thread by careful thread, until nothing remained but the old, familiar story the county had always wanted to believe about girls like her. She would not let that happen. Whatever it cost her, whatever careful investigation and patient proof gathering the coming weeks required, Alina Whitfield intended to prove, once and for all, exactly how wrong that old familiar story truly was. The following days settled into a careful, quiet rhythm of investigation, though not the kind Alina had ever imagined herself undertaking. Beatrice, eager to help and possessing a far wider network of household connections than Alina herself, began making discreet inquiries among servants and tradespeople she trusted, people who moved through the grand houses of the county largely unnoticed, and often heard far more than their employers realized. It was through one such quiet conversation, with a young messenger boy who had once delivered letters for Fairweather House, that the first solid thread finally emerged. The boy remembered, when gently prompted by Beatrice over a shared meal at a local inn, a particular errand from several weeks earlier, delivering a sealed letter not to any household within the county, but to a writer bound for a distant town, someone the boy described only as a woman known for crafting letters in other people's handwriting, for a fee, when discretion was required. He could not remember the exact address, only the general direction the writer had taken, but it was enough of a beginning for Beatrice to press further, tracing the connection carefully over the following days through a patient chain of small, careful questions. Meanwhile, Reginald had undertaken his own investigation, driven by a determination to prove, both to his father and to Alina, that his commitment to uncovering the truth was genuine rather than performative. He confronted Charles first, certain his friend's wide social connections might yield useful information, and Charles, though initially hesitant to involve himself further in a matter that had already caused his friend considerable difficulty, eventually agreed to make quiet inquiries of his own among their mutual acquaintances. It was Charles who first suggested, carefully and with visible reluctance, that Reginald consider Constance Fairweather directly as a possible source. "I do not say this lightly," Charles admitted during one of their private conversations. "But I have noticed, these past weeks, how closely she has followed every development in this story, how quickly she seems to know details that most of the county only learns days later. It may mean nothing, but it seemed worth mentioning, given everything at stake." Reginald turned the suggestion over carefully in his mind, uncomfortable with the idea of directly accusing a woman of Constance's social standing without solid proof, yet unable to shake the growing suspicion that Charles's observation carried real weight. He decided, finally, on a careful approach, requesting an ordinary social visit to Fairweather House under the pretense of continuing conversations about a shared interest in classical literature, hoping that a direct, unhurried conversation might reveal something the careful investigations of servants and messengers could not. Constance received him warmly, betraying nothing in her composed, gracious hospitality, and for the better part of an hour, their conversation remained entirely ordinary, discussing books and shared acquaintances with the easy familiarity of two people who had known each other for years. It was only near the end of the visit, as Reginald prepared to take his leave, that he decided to test the waters directly, mentioning, with careful casualness, the unsigned letter that had caused so much difficulty for both himself and Alina. "A curious thing, is it not," he said, watching Constance's expression closely as he spoke, "that someone would go to such trouble, crafting a letter designed specifically to cause maximum damage at precisely the moment it would be most believed. Whoever wrote it clearly understood the county's gossip networks with remarkable precision." Constance's composure did not break, not visibly, but Reginald, watching closely, caught the smallest flicker of something sharp and calculating behind her eyes before she smoothed her expression back into polite concern. "How troubling," she said smoothly. "I do hope you and Miss Whitfield are able to identify the responsible party soon. Such cruelty deserves consequences." It was a perfectly composed response, betraying nothing overtly, and yet something in the careful precision of her reaction, the slight delay before she spoke, the too-practiced concern in her voice, confirmed for Reginald what Charles's earlier suspicion had only suggested. He left Fairweather House that afternoon without proof, but with a growing, uncomfortable certainty that would only be fully confirmed days later, when Beatrice's careful chain of inquiries finally traced the mysterious letter writer to a small cottage 2 towns over, and the woman living there, after considerable and careful persuasion, admitted, with visible reluctance, that she had indeed been paid to craft a letter in an unfamiliar hand several weeks earlier, by a woman matching Constance Fairweather's exact description. The proof, once finally gathered, arrived not as a single dramatic discovery, but as a careful accumulation of small, quiet confirmations, each one strengthening the picture until it became impossible to reasonably deny. Alina received the full account from Beatrice and Reginald together, sitting once again at the small wooden table in her family's farmhouse, and felt a complicated mixture of vindication and genuine sorrow settle over her, as she absorbed the confirmation of what she had already begun to suspect. She did this because she felt threatened, Alina said slowly, working through her own understanding of Constance's motivations aloud. Not because she believed the rumors herself, but because my rise, however small in the grand scope of the county, made her own carefully built position feel less secure. That is not an excuse for what she did. But I think it matters understanding why, if I am to decide what to do about it now that I know. And what do you intend to do? Reginald asked quietly, watching her with careful, genuine curiosity rather than any attempt to influence her decision. Alina considered the question for a long moment before answering, her mind already turning toward the far more public reckoning she sensed was still ahead of her, a moment she could feel approaching even before she fully understood its shape. I intend, she said finally, to make certain the truth is heard clearly enough that it cannot easily be buried beneath the noise of rumor again. But I do not yet know exactly how. That, I think, requires more careful thought than tonight allows. Reginald nodded slowly, respecting the weight of her hesitation rather than pushing for an immediate answer. Whatever you decide, he said, I intend to stand beside you through it, regardless of what my father or anyone else in this county thinks that decision costs me. Alina studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any trace of performance, and found, once again, only steady, genuine sincerity. Something in her chest, cautious and guarded for so many weeks now, allowed itself just slightly to soften further. Whatever came next, whatever public reckoning still lay ahead, she understood clearly that she would not be facing it entirely alone. And for the first time since the rumors had first begun spreading through the county like wildfire, that quiet certainty felt like the steadiest ground she had stood on in weeks. The invitation arrived exactly 9 days later, engraved and formal, summoning the county's finest families to a grand autumn gathering at Fairweather House, the largest social event the county had seen in over a year. Alina received her own invitation with a mixture of wariness and grim understanding, recognizing immediately that Constance would not have extended such an invitation, especially now, without some further purpose in mind. I do not trust this, Beatrice said flatly, when Alina showed her the invitation. Why would she invite you, of all people, after everything we now know she has done? Because, Alina said slowly, turning the engraved card over in her hands, she believes she still holds the advantage. She does not know we have traced the letter back to her. As far as she understands, I remain entirely unaware of her involvement, which means she likely intends to use this gathering for something further, confident that I will walk into it just as unprepared as I did the afternoon tea weeks ago. Then perhaps you should not attend at all, Beatrice suggested carefully. Alina considered this for a long moment before shaking her head firmly. No, she said. If I stay away, it will only look as though the rumors have finally succeeded in frightening me into hiding. I need to attend, Beatrice, and I need to be prepared for whatever she intends, rather than avoiding the confrontation entirely. Over the following days, Alina, Reginald, Beatrice, and even Sir Walter met quietly on several occasions, carefully preparing for whatever Constance might attempt. Sir Walter, drawing on decades of experience navigating the county's social maneuvering, suspected Constance would not risk another private, easily deniable letter. Given how thoroughly her earlier scheme had already begun unraveling beneath careful investigation, she would more likely attempt something bolder, something public, delivered in front of enough witnesses that Alina would have no easy way to quietly deflect it. She will want an audience, Sir Walter said grimly. Someone as calculating as Lady Fairweather does not simply wish to damage your reputation privately. She wishes to be seen delivering the final blow herself, in a setting she controls completely, surrounded by people whose opinions matter most to both of you. On the evening of the gathering, Alina arrived at Fairweather House dressed carefully, not in an attempt to disguise her origins, but in quiet, deliberate acknowledgement of them, wearing her mother's altered blue dress once again, understanding instinctively that whatever Constance intended to attempt, hiding from her own history would only strengthen whatever narrative Constance hoped to construct. The grand ballroom was filled with even more guests than the night of the original Ashcombe ball. The entire county's finest families gathered beneath glittering chandeliers, and Alina felt the familiar weight of curious, watchful eyes settle over her the moment she entered. Reginald found her quickly, positioning himself close enough to offer quiet support without drawing unnecessary attention to the connection between them, a careful balance they had discussed and agreed upon beforehand. For the first hour, the gathering proceeded ordinarily enough, filled with music and polite conversation, and Alina began to wonder whether Constance intended to strike at all, or whether the careful preparations of the preceding days had simply been unnecessary caution. That illusion shattered the moment Constance approached her directly, in the center of the crowded ballroom, her voice pitched deliberately loud enough to carry to the surrounding guests. "Miss Whitfield," Constance said, her smile sharp and bright, "I wonder if you might indulge us all with a small demonstration this evening. I understand your Latin is quite exceptional, remarkable enough to humble even Oxford-educated gentlemen. Perhaps you would honor us with a genuine test, rather than simply relying on stories and rumor to establish your reputation." The surrounding conversation quieted immediately, guests turning with obvious interest toward the unfolding confrontation, exactly as Constance had clearly intended. Alina understood immediately what was happening, recognizing this as the public stage Sir Walter had predicted, though the exact shape of Constance's attack remained still unclear. "I would be happy to demonstrate whatever knowledge I possess," Alina said carefully, maintaining calm, deliberate composure despite the growing crowd of watchful eyes. Constance's smile widened. "Wonderful," she said. "I happen to have arranged, quite by coincidence, for a distinguished visitor this evening, a genuine university scholar, recently arrived from abroad, who has graciously agreed to test your abilities properly, rather than relying on the informal exchanges you have grown accustomed to among friendly company." A murmur rippled through the surrounding guests as a stern-faced older gentleman stepped forward from the crowd, introduced by Constance as Professor Aldrich Thorne, a visiting classical scholar whose credentials, she made certain to emphasize loudly, far exceeded anything the county's own amateur circles could offer. Alina recognized immediately the careful trap being constructed around her, understanding that Constance intended not simply to test her knowledge, but to stage a public humiliation dressed carefully in the appearance of legitimate scholarly examination, likely arranged with a scholar sympathetic to Constance's own interests, prepared in advance to declare Alina's knowledge shallow or insufficient regardless of her actual performance. She glanced briefly toward Sir Walter, who stood a short distance away, his expression carefully neutral though his eyes carried a steady, reassuring calm that helped settle her own rising nerves. "I accept the examination," Alina said clearly, her voice carrying steadily across the now silent ballroom, "on one condition: that the examination be conducted openly, with questions and answers spoken aloud for the full benefit of everyone present, rather than in private, where its fairness cannot be properly witnessed by the very audience Lady Fairweather has so generously assembled." A flicker of something uncertain crossed Constance's expression, quickly masked, though Alina caught it clearly enough to understand she had disrupted whatever careful arrangement had been made in advance. Professor Thorne, visibly less prepared for public scrutiny than Constance had perhaps promised him, cleared his throat and began, somewhat stiffly, posing a series of increasingly complex questions regarding Roman history, classical rhetoric, and philosophical texts. Alina answered each question with steady, careful precision, drawing not simply on memorized facts, but on the genuine, deep understanding her mother had spent years cultivating in her, occasionally offering additional context or alternative interpretations that visibly surprised the professor with their sophistication. The surrounding crowd, initially skeptical, gradually shifted into something closer to genuine fascination, murmuring appreciatively as Alina navigated each question with growing confidence. It was near the end of the examination that Professor Thorne, perhaps growing uncomfortable with how thoroughly Alina was exceeding his expectations, attempted a final, more aggressive line of questioning, suggesting, with barely veiled condescension, that true scholarship required years of formal university training that no farmhouse education could ever properly replicate, regardless of natural talent. Alina met this challenge directly, without hesitation. "With respect, Professor," she said clearly, her voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom, "formal institutions certainly offer valuable structure and resources. But scholarship, at its heart, is simply the discipline of careful, patient thought applied consistently over time. My mother possessed no university education herself, and yet she taught me to think more rigorously than many formally educated men I have since encountered. If true understanding required nothing more than the right building to study within, I do not believe Cicero himself would have written so extensively about the cultivation of virtue through personal discipline, rather than institutional privilege. A ripple of surprised, appreciative laughter moved through the crowd, several guests nodding approvingly at the neat, precise turn of her argument. Professor Thorne, visibly caught without an adequate response, offered only a stiff, reluctant acknowledgment of her point before excusing himself from further questioning entirely, clearly unwilling to continue a public examination that had turned so thoroughly in Aline's favor. Constance, watching her carefully constructed plan collapse in front of the very audience she had assembled to witness Aline's humiliation, made one final, desperate attempt to salvage the confrontation. "Impressive," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confident sharpness. "Though I wonder, Miss Whitfield, whether such skill with words might simply reflect a talent for performance rather than genuine substance. After all, you have proven capable of crafting convincing arguments. I wonder if you are equally capable of honesty, when the subject turns from Cicero to matters closer to your own conduct these past weeks." The room stilled again, sensing correctly that Constance was finally moving toward the true purpose behind the evening's carefully staged examination. Aline felt her heartbeat quicken, understanding that this, finally, was the moment she had been preparing for. "I welcome that conversation as well," Aline said calmly, holding Constance's gaze steadily. "Since you raise it directly, perhaps this is the appropriate moment to discuss the letter that recently circulated through this county, the one suggesting dishonorable promises between myself and Lord Ashcombe, a letter I understand was crafted, at considerable expense, by a woman in a distant town skilled in disguising handwriting for hire." Constance's composure finally cracked, just slightly, a flash of genuine alarm crossing her carefully arranged features before she managed to smooth it back into practiced calm. "I am not certain what you are suggesting, Miss Whitfield," she said, though her voice had lost its earlier confident edge. "I am suggesting nothing," Aline said clearly, loudly enough for the entire silent ballroom to hear every word. "I am stating plainly what careful investigation has confirmed. The woman who crafted that letter has already confirmed, to witnesses present here this evening, that she was paid for her services by a woman matching your exact description, Lady Fairweather. I did not wish to make this accusation publicly. I would have preferred a private resolution. But since you have chosen this evening, in front of this audience, to question my honesty, I believe the full truth deserves the same public setting you yourself selected." The silence that followed was even more complete than the silence that had once followed her original rebuke of Reginald months earlier. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward Constance, whose face had gone pale, her earlier confident composure entirely abandoned as murmurs of shock and disapproval began rippling outward through the crowd. Reginald stepped forward at that moment, adding his own quiet confirmation to Aline's accusation, describing his own careful investigation and his direct conversation with Constance weeks earlier, his testimony carrying particular weight given his own position within the county's social hierarchy. Sir Walter added his own measured endorsement of the evidence they had gathered, his reputation as a respected scholar lending further credibility to the unfolding revelation. Constance, surrounded now by the same watchful, judgmental crowd she had once assembled specifically to witness Aline's downfall, found herself instead the subject of exactly the kind of public scrutiny she had hoped to direct entirely towards someone else. She left the gathering shortly afterward, her carefully cultivated reputation, built over years of patient social maneuvering, unraveling in the span of a single evening far more thoroughly than Aline's had ever been at risk of unraveling, even at the height of the rumors Constance herself had so carefully constructed. Alina remained in the ballroom long after Constance's departure, accepting a steady stream of guests eager to offer their apologies for ever doubting her, their admiration now entirely unguarded and genuine rather than cautiously curious. She accepted each apology graciously, though she found herself, throughout the remainder of the evening, thinking less about her own vindication and more about the quiet lesson underlying everything that had unfolded. She had not defeated Constance through cleverness or manipulation of her own. She had simply told the truth, clearly and consistently, and allowed that truth to stand on its own weight against every careful scheme constructed to bury it. As the evening finally drew to a close, Reginald found her near one of the tall windows overlooking the darkened gardens, the same spot, she realized with a small, private smile, where Sir Walter had first approached her all those months ago at the Ashcombe ball. "You handled that with more grace than I believe I could have managed," Reginald said quietly, standing beside her. Alina considered his words for a moment before answering. "I did not handle it alone," she said. "Whatever grace I found tonight, I found it because I was no longer facing this alone, the way I was on the night your father's ball first began this entire story. That, I think, has made all the difference." Reginald studied her carefully in the soft candlelight, something warm and unguarded settling into his expression. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "we ought to make certain that remains true, for whatever comes next." Alina met his gaze steadily, understanding the deeper question folded carefully inside his simple words. And for the first time since that first sharp, cruel sentence in Latin had first divided her life into a before and an after, she allowed herself to imagine a future shaped not by the assumptions others made about her origins, but by the truth of who she had proven herself, again and again, to genuinely be. Winter arrived early that year, dusting the fields around the Whitfield farm with a thin layer of silver frost, and Alina stood once again at her bedroom window, watching the sunrise stretch slowly across land that had shaped every part of who she had become. Nearly a year had passed since that single sharp sentence in a crowded ballroom had first divided her life into a before and an after, and standing there now, she could hardly recognize the quiet, uncertain girl who had once walked nervously through Ashcombe Manor's tall oak doors, unsure whether she truly belonged in any room beyond her own family's small kitchen. So much had changed since that night, and yet, standing at this familiar window, looking out over these familiar fields, she understood clearly that the most important parts of who she was had never changed at all. Constance Fairweather had left the county entirely within weeks of that final confrontation, her family's reputation too damaged by the scandal to easily recover within the same social circles she had once dominated so completely. Alina had felt no particular satisfaction in her downfall, only a quiet, sober understanding of how quickly careful, patient cruelty could unravel when finally exposed to honest daylight. She thought sometimes, in her quieter moments, of the sharp, calculating fear that must have driven Constance's actions in the first place, the fear of being made irrelevant by someone whose talent required no careful cultivation at all, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she pitied the woman nearly as much as she resented her. Reginald's relationship with his father had taken longer to fully repair, though repair, gradually, it had. Lord Marcus Ashcombe, faced with undeniable proof of both his son's genuine character and Constance's deliberate deception, had eventually softened his rigid opposition, though not without considerable private struggle. It was Sir Walter, ultimately, who had helped bridge the remaining distance between father and son, arranging a private conversation between Marcus and Alina herself, one that had allowed the older lord to finally see, directly and without the distortion of gossip or rumor, exactly the kind of person his son had chosen to align himself with. "I confess," Marcus had told her during that conversation, months earlier now, "I expected to find exactly the kind of calculating ambition Lady Fairweather's rumors suggested. I find instead someone considerably more thoughtful than half the young women born into circles that would have welcomed her without question, based on nothing more than the accident of her birth. I owe you an apology, Miss Whitfield, for judging you so unfairly before ever truly knowing you." Alina had accepted that apology graciously, understanding that genuine change in a man who had spent his entire life within such rigid social boundaries would never arrive all at once, but would instead unfold slowly, through small, careful adjustments exactly like this one. Sir Walter's introduction to the Camden Circle had opened doors Alina could never have fully anticipated that first uncertain evening in his grand library. She had over the following months begun contributing her own written essays to several respected publications. Her work initially published under a carefully chosen set of initials rather than her full name, though word of the true author behind those increasingly celebrated essays had gradually spread through scholarly circles regardless, earning her a quiet, growing reputation entirely separate from the dramatic story of the ballroom that had first brought her to public attention. Harriet Sinclair had become something between a mentor and a genuine friend, the two women corresponding regularly, exchanging ideas and critiques with the easy familiarity of true intellectual equals. It was Harriet who had first suggested, gently but firmly, that Alina consider compiling her essays into a proper published collection of her own, an idea Alina had initially dismissed as impossibly ambitious before slowly allowing herself to seriously consider it. "You have already proven," Harriet had told her during one such conversation, "that talent does not require the right birth to flourish. Perhaps it is time you proved, just as clearly, that it does not require hiding behind initials either." Alina's father, Edmund, had watched his daughter's continuing rise with a quiet, steady pride that never once curdled into the kind of anxious possessiveness Alina had half feared might eventually emerge as her world grew increasingly distant from the small farm where she had been raised. If anything, Edmund seemed to understand, more clearly than anyone else in her life, exactly how important it remained for Alina to carry her origins forward proudly, rather than leaving them quietly behind, as she moved into rooms he himself would never have imagined entering. "Your mother used to say," he told her one evening, as the two of them sat together by the fire in the same small farmhouse kitchen where so much of this story had first begun, "that the finest thing about you was never simply how much you knew, but how completely you refused to let anyone convince you that knowing it made you something other than what you already were. I think, watching you these past months, I finally understand exactly what she meant." Alina had reached across and taken her father's weathered hand in hers, feeling, as she often did in such quiet moments, the steady, grounding presence of her mother's memory woven carefully through everything good that had unfolded since that fateful night at Ashcombe Manor. She still visited her mother's small collection of books regularly, the same worn volumes that had once formed the entire foundation of her education, and she found, even now, new insights hidden within their careful, handwritten margin notes, small gifts her mother had left behind without ever knowing exactly how far they would eventually carry her daughter. As for Reginald, the quiet question he had raised that evening at Fairweather House had continued to develop steadily over the following months, neither rushed nor forced, but allowed instead to grow at its own careful pace, tested repeatedly against the genuine pressures of a world that still, in many corners, resisted the idea that two people from such different origins might build something lasting together. There had been difficult conversations, moments of doubt on both sides, and more than a few additional confrontations with those who still believed, quietly or openly, that certain boundaries ought never to be crossed regardless of individual merit or character. But Reginald had proven, consistently and repeatedly, exactly the steady transformation he had promised on that first uncertain visit to the Whitfield farm, standing firmly beside Alina through every subsequent challenge, rather than retreating whenever the pressure from his own social circle grew uncomfortable. It was this consistency, more than any single grand gesture, that had gradually convinced Alina, cautious as she remained by nature and by hard experience, that his commitment ran considerably deeper than mere fascination with a novelty that had once entertained an entire county's gossip. On a cold, bright morning in early winter, nearly a full year after that first sharp Latin insult had changed the entire shape of her life, Reginald arrived once more at the Whitfield farm, though this visit carried a different weight than any of the many visits that had preceded it. He found Alina exactly where he most often did, near the low stone wall at the edge of the field where their very first honest conversation had unfolded so many months earlier. And this time, when he asked to speak with her privately, her father did not simply nod from a careful distance, but stepped forward himself, extending his weathered hand toward the young lord who had, over the course of a single remarkable year, proven himself considerably more than the arrogant young man who had once mocked his daughter in a crowded ballroom. What passed between Reginald and Alina at that stone wall that morning remained, for the most part, a private matter between the two of them, though the wide, unguarded smile Alina carried back into the farmhouse afterward told her father everything he needed to understand without requiring a single word of explanation. News of their eventual engagement spread through the county with the same speed that had once carried news of Alina's original public rebuke, though this time, the story that traveled from household to household carried a very different tone, one of genuine warmth and admiration rather than scandal or suspicion. Even among those who had once doubted whether such a match could ever truly succeed, most found themselves, in time, quietly won over by the evident sincerity of the partnership Alina and Reginald had built together, tested and proven repeatedly across a year that had offered them every possible reason to abandon it. Sir Walter, upon hearing the news, arrived at the farmhouse personally to offer his congratulations, along with a small, meaningful gift, a rare edition of Cicero's collected essays, bound in fine leather and inscribed on its first page with a simple, heartfelt note expressing his gratitude for having lived long enough to witness someone finally prove, so completely and so publicly, exactly the argument he had spent his own career quietly believing in. True nobility, he had written, has never required the right name or the right birth. It requires only the courage to speak truth clearly, and the patience to let that truth stand firm against every attempt to bury it. You have taught this entire county something it desperately needed to learn, Miss Whitfield, and I suspect the lesson will continue rippling outward long after both of us are gone. Alina kept that book, alongside her mother's own worn collection, in a place of particular honor within the small farmhouse she still considered, despite everything that had changed, her truest home. As winter deepened around the county and preparations for the wedding slowly began taking careful shape, Alina found herself returning often, in quiet moments, to the memory of that first fateful evening at Ashcombe Manor, the sharp Latin insult, the sudden, electric silence that had followed her response, the moment everything in her life had shifted onto an entirely new and unexpected path. She understood now, with a clarity she could not have possessed on that original night, that the true victory had never been simply outsmarting a young lord in front of a crowded ballroom. The true victory had been refusing, at every subsequent challenge, to let anyone convince her that her worth depended on anything other than the character and knowledge she carried within herself. Gifts patiently built by a mother who had never lived to see how far they would eventually carry her daughter, but who had believed, unwaveringly, that they eventually would. The pig farmer's daughter who had once stood alone in a hostile ballroom, defending herself with nothing more than careful words and hard-won knowledge, had become, over the course of a single remarkable year, something the aristocracy could no longer dismiss or diminish, not because she had abandoned where she came from, but because she had proven, again and again, exactly how much dignity and brilliance that humble origin had truly contained all along. And as she looked toward the future now unfolding before her, Alina understood with quiet, unshakable certainty that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she would face them the same way she had faced every challenge since that first electric moment in Latin, with her mother's patient lessons steady in her heart, her father's quiet strength behind her, and an unwavering belief that truth, spoken clearly and held firmly, would always eventually find the light it deserved. The wedding itself took place the following spring, not within the grand halls of Ashcombe Manor as many had originally expected, but in the simple stone chapel nearest the Whitfield farm, a modest building Alina had attended every Sunday of her childhood, its wooden pews worn smooth by generations of farming families exactly like her own. Reginald had insisted on this choice himself, understanding, finally and completely, exactly how important it remained that their new life together honor rather than erase the world that had shaped the woman he loved. The small chapel that day was filled with an unlikely gathering: farmers and scholars, tenant families and titled lords, Sir Walter seated comfortably beside Edmund Whitfield, Harriet Sinclair exchanging quiet conversation with Charles Bramwell, Beatrice Hollis dabbing carefully at her eyes throughout the entire ceremony, unable to fully contain her emotion at witnessing the culmination of a friendship that had begun with a simple, kind decision to bring an overlooked young woman to a ball she had never truly been meant to attend. Lord Marcus Ashcombe, standing near the front of the chapel beside his son, watched the ceremony unfold with an expression that had softened considerably over the preceding months, the rigid disapproval of that first difficult conversation long since replaced by something closer to genuine, if still occasionally uncertain, acceptance. When Alina walked down the simple aisle in a gown her own hands had helped stitch, incorporating delicate lace that had once belonged to her mother, carefully preserved through years of careful storage, even Marcus found himself unable to deny the quiet dignity radiating from every part of her presence. Edmund Whitfield walked his daughter down that narrow aisle himself, his weathered face carrying an expression of pride so complete it seemed almost to erase, for that single afternoon, every hard year of labor and worry that had shaped his own life. When he placed her hand in Reginald's before the small gathered crowd, he leaned close enough to whisper a single quiet sentence meant only for his daughter's ears, one final tribute to the woman who had made this entire remarkable journey possible in the first place. "Your mother is here today," he whispered. "I feel her, Alina, as surely as I feel you standing beside me." Alina felt her eyes fill with unexpected tears at those words, though they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow, and she carried that quiet certainty with her through every remaining moment of the ceremony, feeling her mother's steady, patient presence woven through every part of the day exactly as it had been woven through every part of the remarkable year that had preceded it. Following the ceremony, the celebration continued late into the warm spring evening, spilling out from the small chapel into the surrounding fields, where farmers and aristocrats alike shared food and conversation with an ease that would have seemed entirely impossible to imagine only a year earlier. Sir Walter, raising a toast toward the end of the evening, offered words that many of the guests would remember and repeat for years afterward, a fitting tribute to everything the remarkable story had ultimately come to represent. "We gather here today," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, to celebrate not simply a marriage, though that alone would be reason enough for genuine celebration. "We gather to celebrate a lesson this entire county has been fortunate enough to witness firsthand, that true worth has never depended on the circumstances of one's birth, but on the quality of one's character, the depth of one's knowledge, and the courage to hold firmly to truth even when the entire world seems determined to look away from it. Alina Whitfield taught us that lesson first in a crowded ballroom, with nothing more than a single sentence of perfect Latin. She has spent every day since proving it more thoroughly than any of us could have imagined possible that first remarkable evening." The crowd raised their glasses together, farmers and lords alike, and Alina, standing beside Reginald in the golden evening light with her father's proud smile visible just beyond the crowd, felt the full weight of everything that single sharp sentence in Ashcombe Manor's grand ballroom had ultimately set into motion. She had walked into that room a stranger, tolerated only through the kindness of a family friend, dismissed by nearly everyone present as nothing more than an amusing curiosity to be quietly overlooked. She left this new chapter of her life instead as someone the entire county had come, gradually and genuinely, to respect, not because she had ever abandoned where she came from, but because she had proven, with quiet, unwavering consistency, exactly how much strength and brilliance that humble origin had contained all along. Somewhere, she believed with quiet, unshakable certainty, her mother was watching this moment unfold, finally seeing the full and complete harvest of every patient candlelit lesson she had ever offered her daughter. And Alina understood, standing there surrounded by the family she had been born into, and the family she was only just beginning to build, that this remarkable story, however far it might continue to travel through the county's memory in the years ahead, had never truly been about defeating a single arrogant young lord in a single dramatic moment. It had always been about proving, patiently and repeatedly, exactly what her mother had believed from the very beginning, that knowledge, courage, and unwavering honesty would always eventually find the recognition they deserved, regardless of how humble the soil from which they first happened to grow. 10 years passed, and the county that had once buzzed with gossip over a single Latin sentence spoken in anger had changed in ways few could have predicted on that distant winter evening. Alina Whitfield, now Alina Ashcombe, stood at the entrance of a modest stone building on the edge of what had once been simply farmland, watching as a dozen young girls filed inside, satchels of books clutched eagerly against their chests, their faces bright with the same nervous excitement she remembered feeling as a child sitting across from her mother at a small wooden table lit only by candlelight. The school had been Alina's own idea, born gradually over years of quiet reflection following her marriage, and funded in part through the modest success of her published essays, which had eventually grown into a respected collection studied by scholars far beyond the boundaries of their own county. She had built it deliberately at the edge of farmland rather than within the grander parts of the county, wanting any child, regardless of whether their father owned vast estates or simply worked the soil with his own hands, to feel equally welcome walking through its doors. Reginald had supported the endeavor from its very earliest planning, using what remained of his family's diminishing but still considerable influence to help secure the necessary permissions and funding, a decision that had cost him a portion of his standing among the county's more traditional families, though considerably less than it might have cost him a decade earlier, before the entire county had watched Alina prove, repeatedly and undeniably, exactly how much talent could be found outside the boundaries of privileged birth. Their own children, a thoughtful, quiet boy named Henry and a sharp, curious girl named Charlotte, attended the very same school their mother had built, seated among the daughters and sons of farmers and merchants, and the occasional minor noble family willing to look past old prejudices in favor of the genuinely excellent education Alina had built entirely from careful principle and hard-won experience. It was on an ordinary autumn morning, not unlike countless others that had passed since the school's founding, that Alina witnessed something which returned her, powerfully and unexpectedly, to the memory of that very first ballroom confrontation so many years earlier. She had been walking the school's modest courtyard when she overheard raised voices near the far wall, and arrived to find a small cluster of older students surrounding a younger girl, no more than 9 years old, whose plain, patched dress marked her clearly as the daughter of one of the poorest tenant families in the surrounding farmland. One of the older boys, the son of a moderately wealthy merchant who had only recently enrolled his children in Alina's school, was mocking the younger girl's accent, her clothing, the rough calluses visible on her small hands from helping her family in the fields before and after her lessons. Alina felt something sharp and familiar tighten in her chest, a memory of standing in a crowded ballroom feeling every eye judge her for exactly these same reasons: the accent, the plain dress, the hands marked by honest labor rather than idle privilege. She crossed the courtyard quickly, though she did not immediately intervene the way her instincts urged her to. Instead, she watched carefully as the younger girl, trembling slightly but clearly determined, straightened her shoulders and looked directly at her tormentor. "You may mock my dress," the girl said, her voice small but steady, "but you cannot mock what I know, because I have worked twice as hard to know it as you have, and someday that will matter more than anything either of us is wearing today." The older boy, caught off guard by the unexpected steadiness of her response, faltered, his mocking smile slipping into uncertain confusion, and several of the other students standing nearby exchanged glances that suggested his cruelty had lost whatever amused audience it had originally been performing for. Alina stepped forward at that moment, not to rescue the girl, who had clearly required no rescue at all, but simply to acknowledge what she had witnessed. She knelt down to meet the young girl's eyes directly, ignoring the surrounding students entirely for a moment. "What is your name?" she asked gently. "Margaret," the girl said, her chin lifting slightly with quiet pride. "Named for my grandmother." Alina felt something catch gently in her throat at the name, a small, unexpected echo of her own mother's memory rippling through this ordinary autumn morning a decade after everything had begun. "Margaret," she repeated softly. "That is a fine name. I believe your grandmother would be very proud of you today, Margaret, and I suspect she is not the only one." She rose then, addressing the small crowd of students who had gathered to watch the confrontation unfold, her voice carrying the same calm, steady authority that had once silenced an entire ballroom full of aristocrats. "I want every one of you to remember this moment," she said. "Not because Margaret defended herself so capably, though she certainly did. I want you to remember it because someday, one of you may find yourself in her position, judged unfairly for circumstances entirely outside your control, and I want you to remember that the measure of your worth was never determined by anyone else's opinion of your dress or your accent or the calluses on your hands. It was determined, always, by the diligence of your own mind and the honesty of your own character." That lesson took me a great deal longer to fully understand than it apparently took young Margaret here. I am glad to see this school teaching it more quickly to the next generation than the world ever managed to teach it to me. The older boy, visibly chastened, offered a quiet, genuine apology to Margaret before the small crowd dispersed back toward their morning lessons, and Alina found herself, in the quiet moments that followed, thinking once again of her mother, of candlelit evenings spent patiently learning Latin verbs at a small wooden table, of a single sharp sentence spoken in cruelty at a crowded ball, and of everything that single moment had ultimately grown into across the following decade. That evening, as she sat with Reginald in the quiet study of their own modest home, built deliberately smaller and simpler than the grand manor he had grown up within, she found herself recounting the morning's events, still turning the memory over carefully in her mind. "It felt," she admitted, "like watching myself from all those years ago, except braver, somehow, than I remember being at her age." Reginald considered this thoughtfully before responding. "Perhaps," he suggested gently, "she is braver because of everything you built to make certain she would have somewhere safe to practice that courage. You did not simply survive what happened to you all those years ago, Alina. You built something that ensures fewer children after you will ever have to survive it entirely alone." Alina absorbed his words slowly, feeling the truth of them settle warmly into her chest. She thought of her mother, gone now for well over a decade, who had never lived to see the school Alina had eventually built in her honor, nor the small library within it that bore her name, filled with books available freely to any child willing to read them, regardless of what their family could afford to pay for such an education elsewhere. She thought, too, of Sir Walter, who had passed peacefully several years earlier, leaving behind not only his own considerable library, much of which Alina had inherited and incorporated into the school itself, but a legacy of quiet mentorship that had rippled outward, through Alina, into the lives of dozens of students who would likely never have had the opportunity to encounter such patient, genuine scholarly guidance otherwise. Of Constance Fairweather, Alina had heard little in the years since that final confrontation, only occasional distant reports of a quieter, more modest life rebuilt slowly in a different county entirely. And Alina found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she carried no lingering bitterness toward the woman who had once tried so deliberately to destroy everything she had built. Whatever fear or resentment had originally driven Constance's cruelty, Alina understood now, with the hard-won wisdom of a full decade's additional experience, that such fear rarely produced anything but more suffering, both for the person driven by it and for everyone unfortunate enough to be caught within its reach. As the autumn evening deepened into night around their quiet home, Alina found herself once again at a window, watching darkness settle gently over fields not unlike the ones she had grown up working alongside her father, fields that had shaped every foundation of who she eventually became. Her son Henry's quiet laughter drifted faintly from another room, mixed with her daughter Charlotte's sharper, more insistent voice, already, even at her young age, showing signs of the same fierce curiosity and stubborn determination that had once carried her mother through a crowded ballroom and out the other side entirely transformed. Somewhere out there tonight, Alina thought, standing quietly at her window, other children just like young Margaret were likely facing their own small moments of unfair judgment, their own quiet tests of character in the face of casual cruelty, exactly as she once had. She could not protect every one of them from every unkindness the world would inevitably offer. But she had built, patiently and deliberately across an entire remarkable decade, a place where at least some of them might learn a little sooner than she had, that their worth was never determined by anyone's careless judgment, but by the quiet, steady discipline of their own mind and the unwavering honesty of their own character. Her mother had taught her that lesson slowly, one candle-lit evening at a time, never imagining quite how far it would eventually travel. Alina understood now, standing in the gentle darkness of her own hard-won, quietly extraordinary life, that the truest inheritance was never wealth or title or privilege at all. It was simply this, the patient, deliberate passing forward of hard-won wisdom, from one generation to the next, until eventually, slowly but surely, an entire world learned to measure worth by exactly the right things. Years later still, long after Henry and Charlotte had grown into adults of their own, long after the school Alina had built had expanded twice over to accommodate students arriving from towns well beyond their own county's borders, travelers passing through the region would sometimes hear an old, well-worn story repeated in local inns and farmhouses alike. A story about a pig farmer's daughter who had once silenced an entire ballroom with a single perfect sentence of Latin. The details had softened and shifted slightly with each retelling, the way stories always do when passed carefully from one generation to the next, but the heart of it remained exactly the same, unwavering across every version anyone chose to tell. A young woman, judged unfairly by the circumstances of her birth, had refused to accept the world's careless verdict about her worth, and in refusing, had quietly changed the shape of an entire community's understanding about who deserved respect and who did not. Some versions of the story emphasized the drama of that original ballroom confrontation. Others focused instead on the school she eventually built, or the daughter and son she raised to understand, deeply and instinctively, exactly the lesson that had taken their own mother so many difficult years to fully learn herself. Alina herself, in the quiet years of her later life, rarely spoke of that original evening at Ashcombe Manor unless directly asked, though when she did, she always returned the conversation, eventually, back to her mother, to a woman who had never attended a single grand ball or debated a single published scholar, but who had understood, with a wisdom the entire aristocracy had taken years to finally recognize, that true nobility was never a matter of birth at all, but of the patient. Quiet courage to become exactly who you were always capable of becoming, regardless of who first tried to convince you otherwise. It was this lesson, more than any single dramatic moment of triumph, that Alina hoped would outlast her, carried forward not through grand monuments or celebrated titles, but through the quiet, steady confidence of every child who ever walked through the doors of the school she built, learning a little sooner than she once had, exactly how much their own worth had never depended on anyone else's permission to claim it.